Now I need to set up my UVs. So let's load up this texture. UVs can be a bit weird, right? But do they have to be this difficult? Let's have a little look at UVs in this video. Now, if you're new to UVs, it's probably because you've always used the generated texture coordinates just to keep things simple. And this is understandable as UVs look very complicated. We have to cut open our mesh and then we have to make sure it all fits within the UVs. So all of this is very complicated and we just don't really want to deal with this. Now, if this is you, don't worry, this video is going to go over all the basics with UVs as well as some tricks and tips on how to make it a whole lot easier and a lot more fun. Now we'll start off with unwrapping very simple objects and then step by step we'll get to tackle more difficult challenges. As a result, by the end of this video you have all the skills to unwrap an entire character's head, which is from my character course. Now before we do that, let's talk about the very basics. Let's first talk about why we want to use UVs and then what UVs really are, and after we've gone over the very basics we can look at some examples. Now if you already know what UVs are and why we use them, you can skip to here. Are they gone? Right, so now that we got rid of all of these smarty pantses, we can now focus on why the UVs are so important and what they really are. Now, joking aside, it's actually really important to understand why we need to bother with UVs. So over here, I got a simple example of Suzanne with a simple material with a single texture. And then we also have a simple rig here with a single bone that's assigned to Suzanne. And if we go to our material view here, you can see we're now using the generated texture coordinates for our texture. Now, on first glance, this might look like a good result. We got the texture being projected onto our object on all axes. However, there's a problem as soon as we try to deform our object. So for example, in this case, we have a single bone here. And if we now try to rotate our object, you can see something funny happens to our texture. It starts to warp all over the place. And this is not something we want for, let's say, a character or any other dynamic deforming object. Now, maybe this is just something that happens only with generated coordinates. Let's have a look at what happens if we use object coordinates. So let's hook this up over here and it looks pretty good. Again, we got good results. We can see the texture is nicely projected all the way across our object. But let's have a look at what happens when we try to distort or modify the object with the bone here. Now, as soon as we try to rotate this, you can see we're not getting good results. We're getting really weird things happening here with our texture. So this is one of the key problems we have with generated coordinates. So let's now compare this with the UVs here. Now, luckily, when we add Suzanne, it already has UVs generated. So let's see the different result we get here. So let's select this bone here and let's go into pose mode. Now, if I rotate this, you can see everything is staying just as it should. Even if we scale this, it doesn't matter. The texture is going to stay consistent all the way across the model. So this is one of the key benefits of using UVs. So now that we know why we want to use UVs, let's now talk a bit about the basics on UVs. Now, before we do that, let me mention that this video is made possible by my character course. We just added over 12 hours of new content to the course talking about retopology and UVs and going really into depth on these subjects. Now, if you're interested in this, do check it out. I'll talk a bit more about this later in the video. So what does UV actually stand for? Now, when we talk about UVs, we technically refer to the two axes within texture space, U and V. Now, you might be asking, why do we call it U and V and not something like X, Y, or Z like we do with 3D space? And this is basically to avoid confusion. Think of it as different dimensions or different universes. So you have the 3D world where you have your X, Y, and Z axes, our 3D space. And then we have our 2D space, our texture space, which only has 2 dimensions. So that's why we call this UV space. So cool, Jim, now we know what UV stands for, but what the heck is UV mapping? Well, so far we have established that we have UV space, which is a 2-dimensional space, and then we got 3D space, which is a 3-dimensional space. Now, we run into kind of an issue when we deal with image textures. Now, image textures work really well with UV space because they're 2-dimensional. Image textures are 2-dimensional and UV space is also 2-dimensional. So it's very easy to project an image texture onto a 2-dimensional UV space. Now, the problem arises when we deal with 3 dimensions. How do we map a 2D image onto a 3D object? Now the main problem here is that we lack a third dimension. So when we project this, it basically starts to stretch on the, for example, in this case, the z-axis. So it's quite obvious that we can't conform a two-dimensional image to a three-dimensional object. But what if we can convert a three-dimensional object into a two-dimensional object? So over here, we're going to use Suzanne as an example. Suzanne here is a 3D object. Now I want to turn this 3D object into a 2D object. So how will we go about this? Well, think for a moment of a tailor who is going to make a really nice suit. Now to make this suit, they're going to use fabric. Now fabric is basically a sheet of fabric. It's two-dimensional. And they have to turn this into a suit, which is three-dimensional. So what a tailor does is get a sheet of fabric, they cut a pattern out of it, and then they sew this together to form the three-dimensional suit. Now, we want to do the exact same thing, but in reverse. We want to get our three-dimensional object and cut it open into a two-dimensional object. And then from here, we can project our image, our 2D image, onto our object that's now in these two dimensions, and then we can reassemble all of these parts together. So we now have the 2D projection stuck on to a three-dimensional object. Now, as we cut open our object to create this two-dimensional plane, and as we bring those then back together, you might notice that certain textures don't line up nicely where we have cut the object open. These are what we call seams. And this is kind of a throwback to the example from earlier, just how a tailor kind of brings pieces of clothing together. The parts where these fabrics join is also what they call seams. And in general, the orientation of our texture might vary along these cut areas, along these seams. So in general, we try to avoid or try to hide these seams as much as possible, just so we don't run into areas that'll look a bit weird. Right, so that's, I think, enough talking about UVs. Let's not actually do some of this. So let's have a look at our very simple example of a cube. And here in Blender, we always start with a cube. So let's have a look at how we can unwrap this simple object. Now, within Blender, we have a dedicated space for unwrapping, this UV editing tab. So let's click on that. Let's have a look at what we can do here and what we find within this workspace for UV editing. Now you might notice that the data tab is open here for our object, and over here we have the UV maps tab. So if we open that, you can see here is a list of all the UV maps assigned to our object. In this case, we only have one, but we can have multiple UV maps per object. Now on the other side here, we have the UV editor. Here we can edit the UVs of our object. Now right now we have no UVs, since I deleted them. Normally when we add a cube, it will already have UVs, but in this case, to learn, I've deleted these. And as you can see, all the geometry here is in this lower left corner. And also when you add new geometry, you can often find over here, which can be a bit confusing. Out of all places to put new geometry, why not in the middle here? This is a bit confusing as, you know, when we add stuff in the 3D viewport, we tend to add it in the middle, so at the center of our 3D space. So why don't we do this with the UV editor? Well, actually we do. And to show this, let me add in a new image. So let's go over here, let's click new image. And we don't need to give it a name, we can just leave it as untitled, but we're gonna change the generated type. So I'm gonna set this to color grid. So let's now add this here. If I now zoom out, you can see we got this nice colored grid, but we also have all of these numbers and letters. And if you look at these here, you can see they're not random. They serve a purpose. We got here A1, A2, A3, A4, etc. These are counting up along the U axes, 1 to 8 here. And if we look at the other side here, we got A, B, C, D, and counting up here along the alphabet along the V axes. So as you can see, we got this coordinate system here for our grid. And if we go to the value of 0 for the axes of both the U and V, we need to go to the lowest in the alphabet and the lowest in numbers, which in this case is A1. And if we now look, where we have our geometry is in the lower corner of this A1 tile. So this tells us this is the 0 point for both of these axes, or this is the center of our UV space. And this is also why when we add new geometry, it all sits over here in this corner. But there's another reason why it's important, so let me show you quickly. Right, so this is a practical example of why it's important. So over here I got a plane here, and this plane is unwrapped along the UV grid. So if we go to our UV editor here, you can see we got it nicely unwrapped. It fits the nice whole grid here. And what I'd like to do is to add to this plane here a gradient texture. So if I connect this gradient texture, which is using our UVs here, if I connect this up, you can see, well, we got a nice gradient here that works as intended. However, if we try to change things here, we maybe set it to a spherical gradient, and now it doesn't look good anymore. Or at least it's not doing what we expected it to do. We might have expected this gradient to radiate from this origin point here, the center of the plane, but instead it comes from this lower corner. Now, knowing what we now know, I think you know what's going on here. The origin point of our texture space is in this lower corner. So this is also why the other gradient works fine, because it starts to radiate out from this origin point towards the right here. So to fix this, all we need to do here is to shift this origin point with a mapping node to put this gradient down the center. Now for this, we can use our mapping node. Now here things get a bit confusing since we have X, Y, and Z locations and we're dealing with UVs. But in this case, the U-axis is the X-axis and the V-axis is the Y-axis. So in this case, we want to shift the U-axis by half a unit. So let's move it by 0.5. However, you can see we've moved it further away. So we need to invert our direction. So let's go minus 0.5. As you can see, now it's right down the middle. So let's do the same for the Y-axis here. The Z-axis we don't have to change since we're only dealing with two axes. If we now set it to spherical, you can see we now radiate from this center point. So understanding this origin point within texture space allowed us now to move this point along the tile here towards the right and then up using the mapping node. So now that we know where the center of our texture space is, it makes it a bit easier to solve problems like these. Right, so that's enough for that tangent. Isn't this video about UV unwrapping and not about texture space? Yes, you're right. So let's get started by unwrapping this cube first. This is going to be the most simplest exercise. Now, we can't see the result of this texture on our cube, so let's fix that first. Now for this, we need to first go to our material tab here. And with our material here, we haven't assigned this image texture. So let's assign it first. So let's go over here to base color and let's add in a image texture. Now from here, we can click on this icon here to see all the images that we have within this project. In this case, we're going to click on Untitled. And now with this image is assigned to our material, but we still can't see it over here on our cube. So what's going on? Well, if we go to our preview window here, you can see the texture is working. So what's going on here? Why can't I see the texture in our 3D viewport? Well, we actually can. So let's have a look here. We can go, for example, to the material preview. Here we can see the material and all its textures. But in the solid view mode, if you also want to see your texture here, we just need to make a small change. We need to go over here to the viewport shading settings. We just set the color to texture. This will now project the active image texture of our material onto our object. So now as we unwrap our cube here, we'll see the results directly in our solid view mode. Now our cube right now is this kind of pinkish color because everything over here is in this lower corner. So as we unwrap this, we should start seeing the actual texture show up onto our cube. So let's actually start cutting open our cube. Now for this, I'm going to press 2 to go to edge select mode here. You can also click over here on the top bar here. And to unwrap, we always need to be in edge select mode since we assign the seams to edges. So now we need to think of how we're going to cut open this box. So think of it as like a box from Amazon or from IKEA and how we can unfold this or flat pack this. So we're going to select some edges here, holding shift to select multiple edges. And we're going to try to cut these open. So let's right click here. And now we should get a menu with all the options for edges. Now here we want to look for mark seam. So mark seam here, we click on that. And this will now cut open these edges. You can also see they have this red color to them. This means that a seam is assigned to that edge. Now, when we add seams, think of it as cutting into the surface. So now that we made this kind of U-shaped cut, we can now unfold this face, as it were, onto this two-dimensional space. So to see this in action, let's actually unwrap this. So let's select everything here. Let's press U. This should give us our UV mapping menu. And we're going over here to unwrap. And I want to select the first option, which is angle based. Now, when we do this, you can see right away it unwraps our cube. And we can see this part that we cut out has quite a clear texture to it. However, if we start rotating, you can see the other parts of the cube, well, it can use a lot more work. So let's fix this. So let's first have a look at what we can see here in our UV editor. Now we can see here we got this tiny face here in the middle, and we got all of these other warped faces coming to basically meet this one face in the middle here. And this is because all of these edges are interconnected. So all these faces are connected to each other, so it's basically trapped. So what we need to do is kind of free this face by adding a few more cuts to our cube. So for now, I'm just gonna go and follow through on the cuts that we made before, going all the way around here. So with these selected, let's now add a seam to these edges. And now this will basically allow these faces here to unfold. This one here as well to unfold. The one that we had already can unfold, but all the way to the other side here. So everything should be able to kind of unfold onto a flat surface. So to test this, let's actually unwrap this now and see the result. And would you look at that? Now we've unwrapped this cube and we basically allow everything to unfold onto a flat surface. As you can see, each of these faces now has a nice clean texture to it. And also, since we're using this color grid, we can also see exactly which face is sitting where along our texture. So this will help us understand actually what's going on over here. So this is why this is a good exercise to play around with the cube, unwrap it in different ways and see what's going on, what's happening, to understand as well why unwrapping works the way it does. Now, to make the learning process a bit easier, what we can do, we can enable a feature that will unwrap our object automatically every time we make a change to the cuts. So for this, we need to go over here to this little menu over here on the top right, and we need to go over here to Live Unwrap. So if we enable this, it will now automatically update the unwrap when we make changes to the cuts of our model. So let's, for example, clear the seams here. So right click, here we're gonna go for Clear Seam. Let's remove the seams from these edges, and right away you can see it's updated the UVs as well. So this is a great way to basically play around with the UVs, find out what works, what doesn't work. And I think it's overall a great way to learn UVs a lot faster when you can see these changes happening live within the UV editor and the 3D viewport. Now, if you're new to UVs, I recommend doing this exercise. It will help you kind of get your head around the super basics here. And I made this file here available to download on our website, so it's easier to get going and get practicing. So you'll have access to this beginner file with the cube, as well as all the other examples, all the way up to this head model. No, wait. You can download it, but make sure you come back here because we're gonna go over these examples together, right? Okay, cool. So now if you know already how to unwrap simple primitive shapes like the cube we've just done, or like cylinders, spheres, all this stuff, skip to here. But if you're a complete beginner, let's have a look together at our next example. Right, so in this example here, I have a cylinder. Now a cylinder is a different story of a cube, so let's have a look at how we can tackle this. Now we have the same setup as before, same material as you can see here with the same texture. And if we go to the Object Data tab here, you can see we have the same UV setup as well. And if we go to our UV editor here, you can see the UVs have been removed. They're all nicely in the bottom left corner as if this was brand new geometry. Now let's have a look at how we handle a cylinder here. Now it's a bit different from the cube, so what we're going to do here first is remove the ends here of the cylinder from the equation. So what we're going to do, we're going to hold Alt and select this loop here for this end cap. Same here for the bottom one here. And what I want to do is add a seam to this to separate the ends from the cylinder. Now before we do that, let's first enable the live unwrap, so when we make changes, we can see these live in the 3D editor. So let's now right click. Let's now add a seam to these two loops. And as you can see, as we add the seam, right away, we separate out these two end caps and they get nicely unwrapped onto our 2D texture. Now, if I have a look at the end caps in the 3D viewport, they look pretty good. However, the rest of the cylinder, the actual base of the cylinder here, is looking a bit messy. So let's have a look at how we can fix this. So let's go to Face Select mode here by pressing 3. And then Alt to select this entire loop going all the way around the cylinder. Now, as you can see over here in the UV editor, it tried to unwrap the cylinder the best it could. So we have this one loop on the outside here, and then this other loop on the inside being all cramped together. So what we need to do is try to free up this part here in the middle so it can expand outwards and get a nice clean unwrap. So if we look over here in the 3D viewport, you can see that the cylinder here, this kind of ring here, is connected all the way around, so it can't really unfold itself. So if we want to try to let this unfold itself, we need to cut somewhere down the length of the cylinder. So let's find an edge that we can then cut. So let's go to Edge Select mode by pressing the 2 key, and then select an edge here. Maybe this one will do. And I want to cut down the length of this. So let's right click, mark this as seam, and as you can see right away, it allowed our UVs to unwrap nice and cleanly. So let's go back to Face Select mode, Alt select this loop, and as you can see in the UV editor, now it's unwrapped nice and cleanly since it can expand now, it can unfold itself since we add this cut down the length of the cylinder. Now this is a technique you'll often use with cylindrical shapes, so when you identify something to be cylindrical, you cut off the ends, and then you add in a cut down the length of it to get a clean result. Right, but a cylinder is simple. What about something a bit more complex like this ring shape here, this torus? How would we go about unwrapping this? Let's have a look. First off, we have the same material, the same setup as all the other times before. And as you can see, all of the geometry is over here in the bottom left corner. So how will we go about unwrapping this? Well, basically, if you think about it, this ring is basically an infinite cylinder shape. Now, what do I mean? Well, let's have a closer look. Let's move the camera up a bit here. And as you can see, this is a cylinder that goes all the way around and then connects up to itself again. Now, if you remember with the cylinders, what we need to do is remove the top and bottom part of the cylinder. Now, since this is basically interconnected or it's connected to itself, we just simply need to add in a cut over here to separate off the ends, as it were. Now, let's make sure we have the live unwrapper enabled. We do. So let's now add in a seam to this. As you can see, it unwraps, but it's not clean yet. So if we go over here and zoom in, you can see we got some texture here, but the rest is very distorted, very warped. So to see what's going on, let's select everything here and let's have a look at our UV editor. Now the result here is very similar to what we had with the cylinder before. Now we've got this one big loop on the outside, but everything else is super tiny and super small over here. So remember, with the cylinder this happened before, so what we need to do was cut it down the length of it. Now we're going to do the same here with this ring. So what we need to do is to find a loop that goes down the length of this ring. So I'm going to select this loop on the inside here that goes all the way along. So this one over here. And then what we're going to do is add a seam to this loop. So let's right click, mark this as a seam. As you can see right away, we get a better result. However, unlike with the cylinder, it's not perfect. So if we select everything, you can see here in the UV editor that it's not a perfect unwrap. At least it's not straight as we might expect it to be. So let's have a look at why this is happening. So let's move this to the side so we can see it a bit better. As you can see, some parts are longer than others. We got these very long loops down the middle, and we've got these shorter loops down the side. Now, why is this? Well, if we look at our ring, and if we look, for example, at where we cut it, so where we have the seam here, now if we compare this loop to maybe this loop on the outside here, you can see the circumference is quite different. So if we go into wireframe, you can probably see it a bit better. Look at the difference between the length of edges on the inside loop compared to the outside loop. So what basically happens is when we unwrap this, Blender tries to make the size of these edges the same in the UV editor, making these center loops longer, while these other loops here, which are shorter, they're also shorter in our UV editor. Now, when we have these difference in sizes, it can lead to stretching. Now, to help us see where stretching happens, we have a tool. So let's go over here to our viewport settings. And over here, we have this UV stretch section. So if we now enable that, and we're going to change the angle to area. And now with this, we can see live on our UV island where we have the stretching happening. So we have this blue color where we have a little amount of stretching. And then we have this green color where there's more stretching. And it makes sense that we have this green color on the middle here, since that's the outside of this ring, which is the part that's more stretched than the inside, for example. Right, so now we understand why we're getting all of this stretching happening along our model, but how do we fix this? Well, there's a way to fix this. So what we're going to do first is find a part along our UVs that is not very stretched. So we've got these blue sections here, which we can then use. Now, first what I want to do is go to Edge Select Mode by pressing 2, and selecting the loops around one of these faces. So I'm going to select this here, right click, and then Auto Align. This will straighten these loops. So let's do this here. Now, if I do this for the length, you might notice it will teleport a bit since it's straightening the entire loop. Now in this case, I think we're fine since we're still getting a straight result at the end, but sometimes you just want to select only the edges around the square or face that you want to straighten out, because at the end, the only thing we really care about is that this face is straightened. Now with this, we want to make sure we have this selected, then select the entire island, now right click, and now we're going to select Follow Active Quads. And as you can see right away, we're getting a straightened result, and the colors now have become a bit of a bluish hue instead of green. And basically what happened here is that all of the faces from our UV island now are following the rough shape of our face that we straightened out before. So if we undo this, I'll show you now what happens if you don't straighten the face. So in this case, let's select, for example, this blue face here. You would think because it's blue, it's not distorted as much. And if we now do Follow Active Quads with this face, you'll see the entire island is distorted. And this is just because that one face wasn't straightened. So when you want to do Follow Active Quads, make sure that the face you're using as a reference, your active face, is straightened out nicely. So now we've got that sorted, let's move this in the UV tile here. It's scaled up a bit as well. And I think that will do. So if we now look at our ring here, you can see the texture is nice and straight and it follows the shape of the ring. But if we jump back into edit mode, you can see we still have these colors that tell me there's stretching going on. Now we can't avoid this because the model in itself is gonna be distorted because certain parts will be longer than other parts and we can't negate that entirely. For example, if we look at our texture here, you can see the outside here, these squares compared to the inside here, that the inside is a lot more compressed compared to the outside. And this is not a bad thing. You have to keep in mind that you're gonna have stretching regardless of what you do. So you're gonna get these colors in your UVs, and this doesn't mean it's a bad UV unwrap. We'll always try to reduce the amount of stretching, but we're always gonna end up with some stretching. Right, okay, so we now know how to unwrap these rings and straighten these out, but what happens if we have a bunch of these and we don't wanna spend the entire time trying to straighten out the UVs for each of these rings by hand? So is there a way to do this faster, Jim? Well, there is. So instead of zooming in here and adjusting each of these faces, making sure they're straight and then using the follow active quads technique, what we can do instead is use add-ons. Yes, Blender is full of add-ons for all kinds of things, and we have a free add-on which can help us with this. So let's go over here to our preferences and let's go to add-ons. Now, as you can see, I got a bunch of add-ons enabled here, but we're gonna focus on a particular set. So let's go to our search bar here and type in UV. As you can see here, we've got a bunch of UV add-ons here, and the one we're interested in is UV Toolkit. You can see over here. Now, if you don't have this in your add-on list, you need to simply go to Get Extensions, search for UV Toolkit, get the extension, and then you should find it here in add-ons. So over here in our UV editor, what we're gonna do is press the N key. This will bring up our toolbar. And over here, we have a few tabs for all the add-ons. In this case, we wanna be focused on the UV Toolkit. In this case, not to be overwhelmed, I'm going to close up all of these tabs except for the Unwrap tab. So let's close everything here. And let's now focus on the Unwrap tab. Now over here, we got a few options, but the one I'm interested in here is Straighten UVs. So let's select all of our islands here first by pressing A, and let's now press Straighten UVs. Now when we do this, you can see right away it will straighten all of these UVs, basically doing the follow active quads technique, but automatically. Now, one thing you might notice though is that the scale is off. The rings in our 3D editor you can see are all the same size. However, in our UV editor, here there are different sizes. Now, I don't want to go ahead and scale all of these manually to make them the same size, so we're going to use again another tool. So let's select all of our UV islands here. And this time, let's go to the UV tab over here, and let's then this time go to Average Island Scale. Now, if we do that, it will automatically scale the islands to the average size. So now all of these rings will have the same size within the UV editor. However, we're not done yet. We get all these islands not really sitting within the UV tile. And again, I'm too lazy to move these all within the tile manually. So is there a way to do this automatically? Well, let's have a look. Let's go back here to UV, and this time let's go to Pack Islands. So let's click on that, and we get a small little menu. Now, this will do is pack all the islands that we have here within the UV tile. Now, we have two options here that we can disable or enable, which is scale and rotate. This will allow the packer to rotate and scale the islands to make it fit within the UV tile. So I'm gonna leave that enabled. Now, the other option here is the margin. This is the distance between each island, the amount of margin it will leave there. So we can adjust that as well. But for now, let's just press pack. As you can see right away, it adjusted the scale of each of these islands here and placed them nicely within this UV tile. So now all of our rings are nicely unwrapped, nicely straightened, and also nicely packed within our UV tile. Now, I'm going to quickly show again this packer here. We can pack it again, and this time I'm going to increase the margin, so the distance between the islands. So I'm going to set this to maybe 0.005. Let's go a bit bigger. Let's go to 0.01. If you now press pack, you can see now the distance between these islands is just a bit bigger, so we don't run the risk of overlapping these islands. So already you're starting to get more comfortable with UVs. Now you know how to use add-ons and how to unwrap multiple objects at the same time. So let's now have a look at our next example. Right, so over here we got a UVSphere. Now, since it's called a UVSphere, we might as well do some UVs, right? So again, we got the same settings as before. We don't have any UVs assigned to this object. It's all in the lower left corner. Now, with spherical objects, there's multiple ways to unwrap it. Now, one way is to simply cut it in half. So if we add a seam here, you can see we cut in half, so we have both the top and bottom separated out, and we get a pretty decent unwrap. However, we do get this nasty seam down the middle, which is not always ideal, but it's an option. So what's the other option? Well, let's remove all these seams here and let's try this again. Now, what we can do is basically treat this as a cylinder. Now, a cylinder, we have end caps. Here we don't. But we can cut it down the length here and treat these poles as these end caps. So let's add a seam to this here. And you can see right away it's unwrapped, but it's very distorted. If we look over here in our UV editor, you can see it's very distorted at these ends here. So let's have a look if there's a way to improve upon this. You can see where we got a lot of pinching going on these poles here. So what I want to do is cut this open a bit to kind of create a bit more space. So to do this, I want to use the circle select tool. So I'm going to press C. I'm going to select all of these edges at this pole. I'm going to do the same over here at the bottom. Again, select all these edges at this pole. And now what we're going to do is mark these edges as seams. Now, if we look at our UVs, you can see we've freed it up a bit, but we still got a bit of distortion going on along our UVs. So what we're going to do now is straighten this out. So we're going to go to our end panel here and press straighten UVs. So if we do this here, you can see it's straightening out all of our UVs except for these triangles at the end here. You can see it's pretty messed up as it doesn't know what to do with these. Even in the 3D viewport, you can see it's pretty messed up. But we can still fix this. So what we're going to do here, we're going to use a trick using pins. Now, to make this work, we need to first enable live unwrap over here within the UV section. So let's enable the live unwrap here. And now with that enabled, what we're going to do is add some pins. Now to do this, we're going to select everything that we want to keep as it is. All of these vertices here that we don't want to change. So anything here that's straightened, we're going to select that. We can move it to make sure that we got everything selected. And I'm going to press the P key to pin these. Now, if we deselect everything, you can see that everything we've pinned now has this red color. So all these vertices with this red color are pinned down. This basically means that Blender can't change these vertices even if we make changes to the setup that we have. Now, what we're going to do now is select all of these points and we're going to move these so we'll update the UVs since we enabled the live unwrapper. Now, as soon as we do this, you can see all these triangles now get updated since they're trying to reposition based on the rest of our unwrap. And now we get a clean unwrap for all of these triangles. Let's now press Alt-P to undo our pins. And let's now pack all of this into the UV tiles. Let's go to UV here. Let's go pack islands, pack. And there you go. We've now packed our UV island. As you can see, we get a nice clean result even on these poles here. So as you can see, just using these simple techniques, we can get really clean results really fast and really efficiently. So I'm pretty happy with this as a result for this UV sphere. Right, so over here we got this very weird cube that's grown an arm and a bowl at the end of it. So as you can see, we have here a bit of a combination of everything that we've learned so far. Now I'm just going to pause the video here and I would suggest you going to the project file now and trying out what you've learned so far, see if you can get this done, and afterwards come back and we'll have a look at how to unwrap this. Now while you're doing that, I get to talk about the update that we've done for our character course. In this course, you'll learn all these steps from start all the way to finish on how to create basically any character. In the first section, we covered not just how to create a character's body, but also the clothes, going into detail with all of this, and we then finalize this with going into some hard surface modeling. Basically, everything you need to know to actually create your character. Now in this update, we've added the second section, which covers everything from retopology to UVs. And here we go into great detail to get the cleanest and best results possible, so you get a good and presentable model you can be proud of. Now, this update adds 6 new chapters with over 12 hours of new content. Now, we go really into depth talking about UVs and retopology, and if you're watching this video, I think it's something that would interest you. Now, if you're interested, go check it out at cjboost.com/characters, as this is a great way to support our YouTube channel so we can keep making videos like this one. Alright, so I think I gave you enough time to download the project file for this weird cube, so let's now have a look at how we can unwrap this. Right, so let's have a look here. We got this cube, we got this cylinder, and this ball shape here. Now, to make things a bit easier, what we're going to do, we're going to separate out parts. So we're not just going to unwrap this cube and then see what we do. Now, first we're going to separate out these cylinder and sphere shape from each other so we can focus on one at a time. So let's select this loop here from the cylinder. Let's add a seam to that to separate it away from the cube. So now we've got the cube and cylinder separated. Now I want to separate the sphere from the cylinder as well. So let's see what we're going to do. We're going to select these loops here. Hold Control to continue the selection. So let's hold Control all the way around like so. And let's add a seam to that as well. Right, so now we have separated the sphere, the cylinder, and the cube. Now to check this, let's go into Face Select mode by pressing 3. And now with this, what we can do is press L to select the different sections. And if they select individually, this means that they are properly separated from each other. And in this case, everything is looking good. So we can now tackle each of these sections one by one. So let's start off first with this cube here. Now, if you remember, unwrapping this cube wasn't too difficult. We're just going to select some of these edges here and create these kind of U shapes. And we're going to continue this through all the way to the other side. So let's do this here. And let's then go and right click and make it a seam. Now, due to the way that we have these triangles in our UVs, we might get some of this bending, but we'll fix this later, no problem. Now, next up over here, we got the cylinder. Again, remember, we just need to cut down the length of it. So I'm just going to select this here and add a seam down there. So that will unwrap that nice and cleanly. And then lastly, we got this sphere here. We can just continue the selection here all the way to the pole, add a seam to that as well. And as you can see, we're just starting to get pretty good results all over the UVs here. Now, we're not done yet. We still need to add some cuts to the pole for the UV sphere here. So I'm going to use the circle select tool, select these here, and mark these as seam as well. Right, so we're almost done here. We now added all the seams that we need to. Now we just need to straighten out these UVs and remove some of this distortion. That's going to be pretty straightforward. So let's have a look at how we do this. So don't be overwhelmed by the kind of weird shapes we have here. It's going to be pretty simple. So what we're going to do first is open our end panel here, and we're going to use the straighten UVs function here. So let's click on that. As you can see, most of our UVs are straightened out, but we have these triangle areas here which are still messed up. And most notably here with the cube, we can see we have this really messy area down below. Now to fix this triangle part here, we're going to do the same thing we did in the past to fix these triangles. We're going to use the pins as a technique to restore these. So let's select everything that we want to keep here for this cube. Let's pin those. Let's now make sure that we have the live unwrapper enabled. And now if we move these pinned areas, it should update the UVs. As you can see, the lower area here is now straightened out. Now we're going to do the exact same thing for these other sections here. We're going to select what we want to keep. So let's select these vertices here. Let's make sure we only select the correct vertices. Let's then pin these. And now if we move this, it will update the UVs here. So it's pretty straightforward and we get a nice clean result. Now lastly, the spherical part here, let's pin these as well, move these, and voila, we're done with our UVs. So now we can clear all the pins. And now with those cleared, we have straightened these UVs and are looking pretty good. So let's now have a look here. Let's pack these within the UV tile. So there you go. And there you have it. So just by applying these few tricks that we've learned so far, we got this nicely unwrapped. It looks really good, very clean and very professional. So if you want to try this, give it a shot, see your results. Let's now move on to something a bit more complicated. Hey, did I get you worried there for a second? Nah, don't worry about it. We're just going to do this very simple button. Now, it's a simple shape, but you might be wondering how to unwrap this. Now, once I show you how to unwrap this, you might be a bit disappointed thinking it's very simple, but you'd be surprised how often shapes like this get people confused. Now, let's have a look at the setup. Again, it's the same material, same UV setup, and all the UVs have been deleted. So let's have a look at how we would approach this. Now, as a rule of thumb, if you're trying to unwrap something and you don't know where to start, is to find the flattest surface that's going to be facing the viewer. So in this case, obviously it's going to be the top side of this button here. So make sure that unwraps as cleanly as possible. So we're going to see this part more than the side, for example. So what we're going to do here is basically apply the same steps that we had with the UV sphere at the start. So where we separated the top from the bottom. So what we're going to do here, we're going to select this loop on the middle on the outside here, and we're going to add a seam to that. Now, as soon as we do this, you can see we're getting a clean result in the top here, but at the bottom, it's looking really rough. So let's have a look at what's going on here. So let's select everything and let's have a look at the UV editor. Now over here, you can see that we got some heavy distortion going on. Now this is because all of these holes that we have in the center of our button are still connecting to the other side. So right now, the entire model is trying to squeeze in through these 4 holes. So to fix this, all we need to do is to cut these open so the back can separate from the front. So let's select all of these loops here and let's add a seam to these loops. And that's already looking a lot better. So let's have a look here. As you can see, it's nice and clean. We don't have any distortion, and the same in the back here, it's now looking a lot better. Now, if we look at our UV editor here, you can see we still have a bit of distortion, but nothing crazy except for the inside of these 4 holes here. Now, this kind of distortion is unavoidable since, well, we are kind of stretching this inwards here. But since it's kind of in these holes, we're not going to really notice this from a distance. Now, as you can see, that wasn't too bad. Now, this is a shape that often gets people confused, but as you can see, once you understand the concept behind it, it's pretty straightforward. Right, so over here we have Suzanne, our trusty monkey. And we have the same setup again, same material, same UVs, same as always. So now what we're going to do is try to unwrap this head. Now this is a bit more complicated since, well, these shapes might not be as obvious. But they're still there. All the basic shapes that we talked about are here. So let's have a look. First off, let's separate out the different shapes. Now we have this mouth area here, which is basically a cylindrical shape. So I'm going to cut that away from the head, which is more of a spherical shape. Now, also going to keep in mind that we have this flat area, which is the face, so we don't want to cut into the face. So we just want to cut around the mouth here. So behind it to separate the mouth from the head. So we're adding our first seam over here. Look at the seam, so now we separate the mouth from the head. Now I want to look if there's any other area that I want to separate out. I'm going to cut out the ears later, but for now I'm going to separate the brow here from the head as well. So I'm going to select this here and mark this as seam as well. Now with those separated out, what I'm going to do now is to cut down the length of this spherical shape for the head. So I'm going to select this here and then cut it all the way across to the other side here. So I'm going to mark this as seam as well. Now by cutting open the head here, we allow it to expand a lot further so I get a better result. Now not done yet, we also want to continue this cut down into the cylindrical shape for the mouth. So all the way to the end here. So let's mark this as seam as well. And as you can see, this now allows this to open up as well. Now, next up, we got a lot of warping with these ears here, so we need to sort that out. Now, what we're going to do, we're going to separate these out, just like we did in the past by separating out these different shapes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select this loop around the ear here to kind of separate this out. So I'm going to select this edge and then Control-click all the way around to select this loop around the ear and then mark this as a seam. Now to do the same on the other side, I'm going to press Control-Shift-M to select the mirrored selection, and we're going to mark that as a seam as well. So let's mark that, and as you can see, now we're getting a cleaner result for the head here. So now we just need to sort out these ears, which are basically, again, cylindrical shapes. So I just need to cut down the length of it. So I'm going to select this edge down the end here, and just Control-click all the way to the tip of the ear here, and mark this as a seam as well. So you can see that right away gives us a better result for the ear. Let's now do the same on the other side. Control-Shift-M, make a seam there as well, and there you go. We've unwrapped these ears now too. So now that we've done the unwrap, let's have a look at our UV editor to see if there's any problems we need to fix here as well. So let's just select the head section here with the L key, and let's rotate this 90 degrees just so it sits nice and straight. I'm going to move this a bit to the left here just so we have this nice gray background so we can just focus on the UVs here. Now right out the gate you might notice some problems here. We got a bit of stretching going on, especially on these brow sections here, and we also have some parts that are overlapping at the mouth area here. So let's have a look if we can fix this. Now for this, again, we're going to use pins. So we're going to press P to pin certain vertices, especially in key areas. So these corners, for example, we're going to pin all of these. And now what we can do, we can move these and it will adjust the UVs based on these pins. Now for this to work, to make sure that we enable live unwrap, so let's enable that here. So that's enabled now. So now if we move these pins, you'll notice that it will adjust the entire UVs based on the location of these pins. So we can now make tweaks to the UVs just by moving these pins. Now, if you want certain areas not to be moved, we just add more pins. So for example, the nose here, I pinned this now. So now if I adjust this, the nose will stay where it is. So as you add more pins, you can make more adjustments, and this way you can easily tweak your UV setup without having to move every single vertex by hand. Another benefit of these pins is that it doesn't matter what you do, these pins will stay in place. For example, if we want to change the unwrap method, so if we press U and then we change it to a different unwrap method, it will keep these pins in place. You might not get the result you want, but it will try to respect these pins as much as possible. So this is a great way to preserve a certain part of your UVs or force a certain result just using these pins. Wow. Slow down, Jim. Did you just mention there's different unwrap methods? Well, yes, there are. So I think it's a good time now to have a look at those. Now to explain this, I'm going to use the Suzanne that we just unwrapped as an example. Now, so far, every time we've unwrapped something, we've used the angle-based method. And the reason I've done this is because as far as I understand, this was the default mode or method in previous Blender versions. At least every result I've gotten from this is very similar to what I used to get. Now, according to the wiki, this angle-based method gives the best results for a 2D representation of a 3D mesh. Now, I have to agree with this because every time I've used this method, we tend to get a more relaxed version of the unwrap. So although it might have more stretching, the overall flow of the UVs tends to be a bit more relaxed and less warped. So let's have a look at the result here. Nothing new, we are used to this. This is the angle-based method. So now have a look at the next method. So we move this across here. Let's create a duplicate so we can compare. And let's unwrap this using the next method. So the next method over here is going to be the conformal method. Now, in my opinion, this is the weird option of the three, as it tends to give really bad results, and I'm not the only one that thinks this. Even the wiki says this gives really inaccurate results. This is for a specific use case. I haven't found one yet, so if you know what to use this for, please comment below. I would love to know. Now, if we use this, you can see right away we get a really bad result. It looks like poor Suzanne got her head smashed in. Looks really bad, and even in the 3 viewport, if we now go and have a look here, you can see the result is just warped and messy. So we can't really use this for our purposes here. So that's it for the conformal method. So now have a look at the final method. So let's duplicate this again. And for this method, we're going to use the minimum stretch method. Now this already sounds a lot better. So let's have a look at what the wiki says. So basically what the wiki says here is that this is the method that tries to reduce the amount of warping and stretching as much as possible. So let's have a look if it really works. And well, would you look at that? That looks pretty good. As you can see, we've reduced the amount of stretching here by doing absolutely nothing. It's all done automatically for us. In the past, we had a ton of distortion in these brows and mouth area, but over here, it's been reduced by quite an amount. So let's have a look in the 3D viewport, and as you can see, it already looks a lot better here. So let's compare this to the angle-based method. You can see we've got a lot of distortion over here along the brow, as well as the mouth. And if we now compare this with the minimum stretched version, you can see we got a lot more detail here, a lot more resolution in this brow area, as well as this mouth area. So this minimum stretch method is definitely something to think about using, as it does a lot of heavy lifting for you. It reduces a lot of this stretching already. So if you already have a good, decent unwrap, this will do that extra bit of help to make everything look nice and clean. So let's put into practice everything that we've learned in this video by looking at this head from the character course. Now, unwrapping a head like this might feel daunting, but now that we know all of our tricks, it might be a lot easier than we expect. Now, before we start doing any unwrapping, let's first look at what we have here with our character. So first we're going to identify all of these simple base shapes. And one thing we want to notice here as well is that the face here is what we're going to be looking at the most. So we want to avoid adding too many seams here and cutting this into too many pieces, as we'll notice that. So what we're going to do is add seams to parts where they won't be as easily noticed. Now next up, we got the head here. This is kind of a spherical shape. Then we have our ears here, we'll likely need to cut out, and we have this cylindrical shape for the neck. Now next up here we have this chest area. This is going to be pretty straightforward. And after this we also have some internal parts to take care of. If we go into wireframe mode here, you can see we have the inside of the mouth, this cavity area here that we need to cut out as well. And then if we hide our eyes here, you can see we also have this part here behind the eyes. So let's now have a look at how we can tackle all of this. Now, just like what we did with the weird cube from before, let's cut out certain parts that we know we're going to have separate. So for example, the inside of the eyes here, we can separate this out by simply adding a cut to this loop on the inside of the eyelid. We won't really notice this cut, so we can freely add a seam here. So let's right click, let's add a seam to this, and as you can see right away, we separate out the back of the eyes and the actual face. Now same over here for the mouth, we're going to separate this out as well. Now I don't want to cut over here since we'll notice this seam. So let's see if we can select a loop further inside the mouth here. So let's maybe select this loop over here. So let's alt select that. I think that will do pretty well. It's further back on the lips here. And if we go into solid view, we can't see this cut. So that's brilliant. So let's go back into wireframe mode. Let's add a seam to that. And now we can see we have separated the inside of the mouth from the face. Now next up, I'm going to separate out this cylindrical shape from the neck here, from the head, as well as these ears here. Now to do this, I'm thinking I'm going to cut down the jaw here. So first around the ears and then down the jawline, so the jaw will kind of cover that cut. And then over here afterwards at the back, we can cut from ear to ear to separate out the neck. Now, it might sound a little bit overwhelming, but as I go through this, it will all make sense. So let's first start cutting around the ear here. So I've got this perfect loop that goes all the way around the ear. So you can make that into a cut. Let's add a seam. Now Control-Shift-M to select the mirrored side. Let's also add a seam to that. And now with these ears cut out, I want to cut down the jaw to create a bit of a separation between the neck and the face here. So let's just cut all the way across and connect up to the ear here. So let's add a seam to that. So now we got this cut off, so the face is no longer connected to the neck. And now to finish separating out the neck, we need to connect the ear to the other ear. I'm going to cut just where the hairline would sit, so we would hide this cut. So let's connect this all the way to here. And let's now add in a seam there as well. So now for the cylindrical shape for the neck, we've cut off the top part, we've separated out the head from the neck. So now we need to do the bottom part of the cylindrical shape. So we need to cut the neck from the chest. So let's select this loop over here that goes all the way around the neck here, and let's add a seam to that. And now we have the cylindrical shape for our neck. So if we now go into our UV editor, you can see here, all we need to do now is to cut down the length of this to free this up. So I'm going to cut it down the back here, since it would be easier to hide the back than the front. So let's add a seam to this. As you can see, this right away unwraps this nice and cleanly. And if we now have a look at the UVs, you can see we kind of allowed this to unfold itself, and this gives us this nice result. Now, we're not done yet. We still have to deal with the head itself. Now, the head here is kind of the spherical shape. Now, if you remember with Suzanne, what we can do is kind of cut down the back of the head to allow it to open up a bit further. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to select this edge over here, and then we're going to select this all the way up to roughly where I would expect the hairline to start. So this way we can hide the seam behind the ear. So I think this way we keep this forehead area nice and clean, and we can hide this cut. So let's add a seam to that. And as you can see right away, this allows the head to open up a lot further. And we can also see this in the UVs. You can see here, the head is allowed to expand into the sides here, giving us a bit more resolution in the face. So now that we've got the big parts done, all we need to do is take care of these smaller areas, like for example, the ears. Just can cut down the length of these, just allow these to open up a bit further. And then also we have to deal with the inside of the mouth. Again, a very simple cylindrical shape. So what we need to do here is to cut down the length of it. I'm going to cut at the bottom here so it can be hidden quite easily. And just by adding the simple cut, we allow the mouth here to open up quite nicely. Right, so we've gone ahead and unwrapped everything now. We've added all of our seams to the character's head. So all that's left to do is to try to reduce the amount of stretching. Now, like we mentioned before, we now have a new method for unwrapping that will do a lot of this work for us. So let's go over here to unwrap and let's select minimum stretch. As you can see right away, it does all the work for us. Our face looks a lot better. We got a lot less stretching going on. And even in our 3D viewport, you can see the texture is relatively consistent all the way across our face, as well as the rest of the head, neck, and chest. Now, that doesn't mean that we're done just yet. We want to have a look, for example, at the layout here. We can adjust this a bit further and tie these up. For example, with the head, we can adjust the rotation and place it nicely within the UV tile. We can also adjust the other parts here, making sure they all fit nicely within this UV space. Now, this is also a good time to make adjustments to our UVs. For example, in this case, I'd like to make some adjustments to the eyelids, because when my character's eyes close, I would like it to have enough texture space on these eyelids. So to do this change, first let's pin everything down. So when we make changes, it won't affect these pinned areas. And then let's unpin some of these loops around the eyelids so we can adjust these. So I'm going to hold Alt and select some of these loops except for the end loop here. Same for the other side. I'll select all of these loops and then Alt P to unpin these. So now if we make changes to the UVs, it will only affect these areas that are not in red. So to illustrate this, if I move one of these vertices at the end here, you can see it will only change these vertices that are not pinned down. So in this case, what I want to do here is to close the eyelids as it were. So when we actually close our eyelids in the 3D space, we'll have enough texture space for these eyelids so our texture doesn't look stretched. So what we can do is just simply adjust these vertices here to create this kind of closed eyelid look for our UVs. Now, once we've done this for both eyelids, we're basically done with the UVs for the face. So if we now look in the 3D viewport, you can see we now have a bit more texture space over here for the eyelids. So if we were to close them, they'll have enough texture space so our texture won't look too warped. Right, so now we've tackled the UVs for the face here and they look pretty good. But aren't we forgetting something? Well, yes, we haven't done the eyes yet. So let's have a look at how we have to unwrap these eyes. Now, with the eyes, we have to take a few things into consideration. For example, in this case, we're using a mirror modifier, so we have to keep that in mind. And also, we will often focus on the eyes. The eyes are the window of the soul, as they say, so we need to make sure that we do this right. Now, when it comes to simple shapes, well, obviously the eyeball is a sphere, so we need to keep that in mind as well. Now, another thing to consider is that the inside of the eye here is basically going inwards, so this will be a cause of stretching. So we'd like to relieve some of that stretching here as well. Now, the easiest way of doing this is just to go in here and cut out the flat part at the back here, so we allow this inner part to fold inwards. So let's go ahead and let's add in a seam to that. Now right away, the inside looks nice and clean, but the rest looks really stretched. So why is this? Well, let's have a look. Let's select everything here and let's have a look at the UV editor. Now we can see here it's kind of unwrapped in reverse. We can see the outside loop here is the front of the eye, while the back of the eye is sitting here in the middle. And we can see this if we turn the camera, you can see that the center of the UV is being projected to this part here. So we would like to fix this by adding a cut so we can reverse this effect. So in this case, we want to add a cut down the middle of the sphere, just like what we did in a previous example. But in this case, I'm going to bring this cut a bit further back so we can hide this cut. So if we rotate the eyes, it won't be seen. So I think this loop here is far enough back, so let's add a seam to this. Now by doing this, we have reversed the effect. So as you can see, now we have the inside of the eye being exactly where I want it on the inside of our UVs. Now you might be asking, Jim, why are we doing this? Why can't we just cut down the length of it like we've done with all the other spheres? Now the main reason is that we don't want to have a cut down here in the eye, since we're going to be looking at these eyes a lot. So I'm going to keep this area clear of any cuts. So I wanted this to look as clean as possible, since every time we look at a person, we always look first at their eyes. Now we're almost done, but we can still make a few more tweaks. When you think about it, when we look at someone's eyes, we tend to look at the iris. So let's add a bit more texture space to the iris part of our eyes so we can add a bit more detail there. Now to do this, let's use the circle select tool and let's select the portion of our UVs that cover the iris. Now with this selected, let's press P to pin this section. And now with this pinned here, let's zoom out and select this loop on the outside. Let's pin this as well. And now we can easily make adjustments to the UVs with the proportions by simply selecting the iris section here and scaling this up. So now if I scale this, you can see it automatically adjusts the other loops. And if we look at our 3D editor, you can also see we now adjusting the proportion of resolution our iris is getting. And we can keep doing this tweaking, and we don't care that the back of the eye is getting stretched more and more, since we're not going to really be seeing the back of the eye anyway. Now, once we've done these tweaks, we can also adjust the back here. Again, like I said, we're not going to be seeing this anyway, so we can scale this island down to save up on space. So there you have it. We've now sorted out the UVs for the eye here. And if you look at the 3D editor, you can see here as well, we got good resolution all on the parts of the eyes that really matter. Now, one question remains though, what to do with the mirrored version of our eye? Is there a way to give it its own set of UVs? Because right now it's using the exact same as our other eyeball. So can we fix this? Well, actually we can, it's pretty simple. First off, let's get this eyeball here to one side of our UVs. So in this case, I'm going to put it in the left-hand side since it's our left eye. And when we do this, we need to make sure we don't pass the middle of the UV tiles. We'll keep it on the left-hand side here. So now that we sorted that out, what we're going to do is make sure that when it mirrors across the object, instead of leaving the UVs as they are, it will also mirror across the UVs. Now for this, we need to go first to the modifier stack here. And in the mirror modifier, we need to go to this data tab. And over here, we can decide what kind of data it will mirror across. In this case, we're interested in the UVs here. And we need to decide which axes we want to mirror across. So in this case, we want to mirror across the U axes. So let's tick that box here. And as you can see right away, it gets mirrored across. And if we look at this G7, this is sitting right over here. The G6 sitting over here. So we can see it mirrored the UVs across to the other side. Now to actually see this, let's apply the mirror modifier. So I go over here and let's press apply. If we now go into edit mode, you can see it has mirrored across the UVs to the other side. So there you have it, we have unwrapped the entire head of this character, and as you can see, it wasn't as scary, it wasn't as difficult as you might have expected it to be. And as you can see, just understanding these very simple tips and tricks make this whole experience a lot more fun. Now, if you enjoyed the process and you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend you check out the character course that we've just updated, which goes now into a lot more detail about doing the retopology and the UVs for not just a character, but also clothes and hard surface objects. It's a lot of information into one single course that will teach you the whole process from start to finish. So if you're interested in it, go check it out at cgboost.com/characters, because without your support, videos as long as these ones wouldn't exist. So that concludes this video. I hope you enjoyed watching this, and if you made it all the way to the end of this video to prove that you've done the whole thing, post this emoji in the comments so let me know you've gotten this far. Now that's it for me. See you in the next video.